The town was quiet that afternoon, the kind of stillness that makes every sound feel louder than it should. A few churchgoers lingered on the steps of the small parish, chatting casually, while others filed out after lighting their candles before the towering Virgin Mary statue that had stood for decades at the heart of the courtyard. It had become more than stone and paint to the people there. It was memory, faith, and tradition carved into form. Parents told their children stories of the statue. Grandparents spoke of prayers answered after kneeling at its feet, and travelers often paused to marvel at its serene expression. That calm was about to shatter in the most unimaginable way. No one noticed the man at first. He blended into the hum of daily life, his dark jacket pulled close against the autumn breeze, his face carrying the heavy lines of someone lost in a storm of his own making. He had passed by the church many times, sometimes pausing at the edge of the courtyard, but never stepping closer. That day, however, something inside him seemed to snap. Without warning, he surged forward, eyes burning, hands clenched into fists that seemed to tremble with fury. The first strike landed against the base of the statue. Gasps erupted as the sound of stone cracking pierced the courtyard stillness. A mother pulled her child close, shielding her eyes, while others froze in disbelief. The man shouted words no one could fully hear, his voice cracking under the weight of anger. He kicked at the pedestal, his fists hammering against the stone figure as though the statue itself bore the weight of his rage. The Virgin Mary's outstretched hand, sculpted in gentle blessing, splintered under the impact. Dust and fragments scattered across the ground. A few men rushed forward, shouting for him to stop. But the man's strength, fueled by something darker than mere frustration, was startling. Each blow echoed with the sound of desecration, until the once pristine figure seemed more ruin than relic. By the time others wrestled him to the ground, the courtyard was filled with a chaos that felt surreal. Some screamed, others cried, while a few stood silently, unable to process what their eyes had witnessed. The man collapsed in exhaustion, his breath ragged, his hands bloodied from striking the stone. For a moment there was only silence, a silence thicker than the air itself, heavy with grief and shock. The shattered statue lay in fragments, pieces of the Virgin's robe and veil scattered like broken glass. And yet, as dust settled in the fading light, one detail struck everyone present. The face of the Virgin, serene and untouched, remained intact, gazing outward with the same calm expression it had always held. In that instant, the crowd's horror gave way to something else. Confusion, awe, and a question none could yet answer. Why had the face remained when everything else had been struck down? The air was no longer silent because of destruction. It was silent because something beyond explanation had just begun. The police arrived within minutes, lights flashing across the weathered stone of the church facade. By then, the man had stopped struggling. He sat slumped against the courtyard wall, his head down, hands trembling as blood from his knuckles smeared his jeans. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The damage had already been done, and the evidence lay scattered across the churchyard in sharp, holy fragments. The statue's broken hand rested awkwardly near the steps, while half of her robe still clung to the bent rebar at the base. But it was her face, miraculously unblemished, uncracked, still serene, that pulled everyone's eyes back again and again. Not a single stone chip marked her cheeks. Her gaze, once meant to bring comfort, now unsettled those who stood before her. The more people stared at it, the more it felt like she wasn't merely looking forward, but through them. Father Mendez was the first to approach the remains. The old priest moved slowly, his face tight with a mix of sorrow and restraint. He had served at the parish for over 20 years, lighting candles beneath that statue every morning. He didn't say anything. He simply knelt down beside the rubble and reached out a shaking hand toward the untouched face of the Virgin. His fingertips hovered a moment before he made contact, just long enough for everyone nearby to feel the air change, like the sudden drop before a thunderstorm. "She's warm," he whispered. Someone scoffed behind him. "It's stone, Father. Probably just the Sunday." But the sun had been gone for nearly an hour. Shadows stretched long across the courtyard, and the breeze had turned cold. The warmth shouldn't have been there, and yet it was. The priest pulled his hand back and crossed himself quickly, blinking hard. The officers guided the man whose name no one yet knew into the back of the patrol car. Still, he said nothing. His face betrayed no remorse, not rage, not peace, just emptiness. But one of the officers swore she saw his eyes flick toward the statue's face just before the door closed, and something like recognition flashed there. Not regret, recognition. By now, a crowd had gathered. Word had spread fast. Phones were out, filming, capturing what little could be understood. Whispers passed through the crowd like smoke. Some called it a hate crime. Others, a spiritual omen. The division was instant and deep. Inside the church, candles flickered as if disturbed by a breeze that didn't exist. Several women began to pray aloud, their voices rising over the quiet. A teenager muttered that the statue looked more alive now than it ever did. A man near the back shook his head and left without saying a word, unable to make sense of anything he'd just seen. No one understood what had truly happened. But deep down, everyone knew something had shifted, like the tearing of a veil or the cracking of a seal long kept closed. And as night fell over the church, silence returned. Not empty silence, but watchful, waiting. By sunrise, the story had already twisted itself into a dozen different shapes. People weren't just talking, they were deciding. In the small cafe across from the church, conversations buzzed louder than the coffee machines. Some claimed it was a deliberate attack against Christians. Others whispered about ancient prophecies, signs, and warnings. A few said the statue had been weeping before the man attacked, though no one could agree on who first said it. All anyone knew for certain was this: something unexplainable had happened, and now it belonged to everyone's imagination. Social media fanned the fire. A shaky video of the statue's broken body, with its untouched face staring straight into the lens, had gone viral overnight. Captions ranged from "proof of the divine" to "religious hoax for attention." Hashtags like "unbroken virgin" and "statue sign" trended regionally. The comments were worse lines drawn in digital sand by strangers who saw only what they wanted to believe. In town, real people were asking real questions. Why would a man destroy a statue like that in broad daylight? Was it targeted? Mental illness? Religious hatred? Or something else, something darker and older that had been sleeping, waiting to be stirred? The most unsettling part was that nobody knew the man's name. He carried no ID, gave no address, and refused to speak. Not to police, not to lawyers, not even to the doctor who tried to clean his bloodied hands. He sat silently in his holding cell, staring at the wall. But every now and then, he'd turn his head toward the window, as though listening for something no one else could hear. Local news stations descended on the church like flies. Reporters asked Father Mendez the same questions again and again. Do you believe this was a hate crime? Is the statue's face being untouched a miracle? What message do you think this sends to your congregation? The priest didn't answer most of them. When he did speak, he kept his words measured and calm. I don't know what it means, he told one anchor, but I do know the statue was more than stone, and I believe it's still island. Not everyone agreed. A local activist group demanded the church remove the remains, claiming they were provoking division. An atheist blogger wrote a piece titled, "Why One Broken Statue Shouldn't Break Our Minds." But their voices were drowned out by the flood of speculation. The most chilling rumor came from a woman who lived 2 streets away from the church. She claimed that after the man was taken away, she saw something in the courtyard. A figure tall, veiled in blue light standing where the statue had once been. It disappeared when she blinked, she said, but it left her with the strongest feeling she'd ever known. It wasn't angry, it was waiting. By evening, the town wasn't just filled with confusion, it was humming with fear. Something had been set in motion, and whether divine or dangerous, it could no longer be ignored. The days that followed fractured the town in ways no one had expected. It wasn't just a debate, it was a rift, quiet at first, then loud enough to reach every home, school, shop, and sanctuary. What had once been a sleepy, spiritually anchored community was now a battleground of belief, outrage, and fear. Some parishioners came daily to pray before the broken statue, now surrounded by caution tape and a crude barricade. They lit candles, sang hymns, and laid fresh roses along the splintered base. They weren't just mourning the destruction, they were defending something sacred. Many believed the untouched face of the Virgin was a message, a sign from God Himself, and they weren't about to let outsiders mock it or erase it. Others, however, weren't so sure. They urged caution. They said it was just a statue, that this could escalate tensions if it wasn't handled carefully. Local leaders called for calm, but no one could agree on what calm looked like. Was it silence? Was it protest? Was it prayer? Inside the homes of the devout, kitchen tables became council chambers. Some said the Muslim man should be charged with a hate crime, locked away forever. Others insisted he needed help, not punishment. Families argued. Friends stopped calling each other. The divide wasn't just between faiths, it was within them. At the community center, interfaith meetings were organized to keep peace, but they quickly dissolved into shouting matches. When a local imam stood to speak, half the room walked out. "We condemn the violence," he said into the silence that followed, "but we also grieve for the man who thought destruction was his only answer. That's not Islam, that's a man lost." Some nodded in agreement. Others accused him of deflection. Tensions bled into every conversation. Local kids who had once played together after school now clung to whichever side their parents whispered about at dinner. Teenagers scrolled through conspiracy threads, questioning if the statue's untouched face was digitally altered. Some even broke curfew just to sneak onto the church grounds and dare each other to touch it, like it was cursed. Then there were those who didn't speak at all, who just watched. People like Mrs. Lyle, who had been baptized at that very statue 57 years ago, and now sat on her porch all day, rosary clutched in hand, whispering prayers no one else could hear. The police were overwhelmed, not with crime, but with unease. Officers reported strange behavior near the church at night, people standing alone, whispering, crying, or simply staring. One officer claimed a man had been kneeling in the grass for hours, unmoving, until they approached and found him fast asleep. When they woke him, he said only one word: "She's still here." No one knew what that meant, but everyone felt the weight of it. Lines had been drawn. And somewhere between faith, fear, and the fragments of a broken statue, the town found itself no longer united by belief but by tension, and something far harder to shake, the sense that this wasn't over. 3 days after the statue was destroyed, the barricade came down not because the investigation had ended, but because no one could agree on who had the right to keep people out. The police had finished collecting evidence, and the church didn't want to keep mourners away. So the yellow tape was removed, the caution signs hauled off, and the courtyard reopened. But something felt different. The moment people stepped past the old iron gate, they slowed their pace, as if the ground itself asked for reverence. Where once there had been a statue that evoked warmth and familiarity, now there were remnants, fractured pieces of stone laid carefully in a low circle, like a memorial. The base had been swept clean, and in its place sat a modest wooden platform just a few inches high, on which the untouched face of the Virgin Mary had been placed upright. People didn't just return, they arrived in droves. Some knelt before the stone face and crossed themselves. Others simply stood in silence. A few took off their shoes before approaching, as if the space had become holy ground. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, asking why the rest of her was gone but her face was still there. No one seemed to have the right words. Father Mendez watched it all from the steps. He hadn't slept well since the incident. He'd been having dreams, vivid ones of the statue glowing in a golden hue, whispering things he couldn't quite remember when he awoke. But what unnerved him most wasn't the dreams. It was the fact that when he returned to the courtyard alone at night, the face still seemed to glow not brightly, but subtly, like light without a source. He hadn't told anyone, not yet. Among the early visitors that day was a woman named Alia, wrapped in a light shawl, her eyes tired but searching. She was the sister of the man who had destroyed the statue. Her arrival caused a stir. Some stepped away, others stared. She didn't say a word to the crowd. She walked directly up to the platform and knelt before the stone face. Her hands trembled as she reached out not to touch it, but to rest her palm on the wooden edge of the display. Then, quietly, she began to cry. A reporter approached her later, trying to get a quote, but she only said, "I don't know why he did it, but I don't think it was really him that day. He was different." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she left before anyone else could stop her. That evening, the sun cast a deep amber light across the courtyard, and for a brief moment, the platform and the stone face seemed bathed in fire. A hush fell over those who remained. It wasn't just a return to the scene. It was a return to something ancient, something watching, something that didn't need to speak to be heard. The forensic report came back with nothing unusual, at least, nothing that made sense on paper. The statue had been made of limestone, common and weather-worn, reinforced with a steel rod that had rusted over time. But what the report couldn't explain was how the face had remained perfectly intact when every other part had shattered. No scorch marks, no cracks, no dust. Even the delicate carving of the eyelashes was still visible. The officer who picked up the report in the precinct muttered, "She didn't just survive, she refused to break." When word of the report reached the church, a new wave of curiosity surged. Pilgrims began arriving from nearby towns, some clutching rosaries, others holding nothing but doubt. A small sign had been erected next to the makeshift shrine. "Please be respectful, no touching. Silence is welcome here." But people came anyway. And while some obeyed the sign, others knelt quietly and reached out, just for a second, to brush their fingers against the stone cheek as if seeking an answer or a blessing. It wasn't long before stories began circulating, whispers carried from person to person, like wind through tall grass. A woman claimed her arthritis pain vanished after touching the edge of the display. A teenage boy said he hadn't spoken to his mother in months, but after praying at the platform, he dreamt of her face and called her the next morning. Another man swore the statue's eyes followed him when he bowed his head in silence. These weren't official miracles. Not yet, but they didn't need Vatican approval to take root in the minds of those who heard them. The local fire chief, Jim Delaney, visited the site one evening. He wasn't the praying type. He didn't go to church on Sundays, and he'd told more than a few people that stone is just stone. But something about the way the light struck the statue's face as dusk approached made him stop in his tracks. It looked warm, not glowing, not radiant, just alive. As if the face weren't remembering the damage, but watching how people responded to it. He went home that night and pulled out a Bible his wife had given him 10 years ago. He didn't open it, but he held it for a long time. Back at the church, Father Mendez finally spoke about what had haunted him since the attack. During Sunday Mass, he told his congregation, "I believe she didn't resist the destruction. I believe she allowed it, except for her face. Because a mother never hides her face from her children even in ruin." Some wept at those words. Others simply stared at the floor. The statue wasn't whole anymore, but somehow its face had become more powerful in isolation than it ever was as a part of a finished sculpture. It was no longer just the Virgin Mary. It was something deeper, something still speaking. And now, more people than ever were starting to listen. The sun had already dipped below the rooftops when the little girl arrived. She came alone, walking with the deliberate steps of someone carrying something important. No one noticed her at first, not until she stepped through the courtyard gate in her oversized hoodie, a tattered notebook clutched tight against her chest. Her name was Lila, 8 years old, soft-spoken. The kind of child adults often described as strange but sweet. She didn't play like the other kids. She watched. She listened. And on the night of the statue's destruction, she had been sitting in the treehouse across the street, legs dangling over the ledge, drawing pictures in her notebook while her older brother played video games inside. Now, standing near the wooden platform, she waited. The handful of people praying nearby slowly took notice. A few shifted uneasily. One woman asked if she was lost. Lila didn't answer. Instead, she opened her notebook, flipped through several colored pages, and turned it around to show what she had drawn. Gasps broke the quiet. On the page was a sketch, rough and childlike, but unmistakable. It showed the Virgin Mary's face intact, glowing in soft light, with broken fragments all around her. Above the drawing, in jagged handwriting, were the words, "I saw her stand back up." Someone asked the obvious question, "What do you mean you saw her stand up?" Lila looked down, as if ashamed, then quietly said, "She didn't have legs, but after he broke her, she floated." She looked around. She looked at me. More silence. The woman who had asked the question took a step back, her mouth slightly open. One of the priests nearby raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. But Lila wasn't done. She pointed at the base of the statue, at the patch of scorched stone where the metal rebar had twisted from the blows. "She stood right there," Lila whispered. "And everything got really quiet. Even the street. No wind, no cars. I didn't even hear my brother shouting from inside. It was like everything paused." Some called it imagination, a child's dream. But when her brother was later questioned, he confirmed she hadn't come inside for hours and that she'd been staring out the window when he finally saw her, frozen in place. What made her story harder to dismiss was the drawing. She had drawn the courtyard, the statue, and even the man before any footage had surfaced online. before the family had been interviewed, before the police had released a single photo. And in the corner of the page, there was something else. A small orb of light floating above the broken stones. She wasn't mad, Lila said. She was sad, but she wasn't mad. By the end of that day, her drawing had been scanned, printed, and shared across the internet. Some mocked it, others studied it like scripture. But for those who stood in that courtyard and heard her speak, one thing was certain. She believed what she saw, and she wasn't the only one. By the end of the week, the story had outgrown the town. National media vans lined the block outside the church. Interview requests flooded the parish office. Lila's drawing, now pinned to the vestibule bulletin board, was no longer just a child's testimony, it had become a symbol. To some, it was sacred. To others, suspicious. And in the middle of it all stood a growing demand from skeptics. Prove it. Experts were called in, skeptical researchers, forensic analysts, even a representative from a Marian apparition study group. Cameras were installed around the church courtyard to monitor activity. Drones captured aerial images of the site, and thermal scans were taken of the remaining stone pieces. The public wanted answers. If something supernatural had occurred, there had to be evidence. And if there wasn't, then the silence that followed had to be broken. The most pressing mystery was the statue's face. Several sculptors examined it under magnification. No adhesive, no reinforcement, no sign of tampering. The fractures from the destruction were clean, random except for the area around the face, where the damage simply stopped. One sculptor from Chicago said, "It's like the brakes dodged it, like it was off limits." He laughed nervously afterward, as if unsure whether to believe his own words. Father Mendez reluctantly allowed a small research team to take 3D scans of the face, but he refused to let them remove it from the church. "She stays here," he told them, firm for the first time since the attack. "If you're looking for proof, you'll find it on sacred ground or not at all." Meanwhile, interviews with the attacker's sister Alia grew increasingly troubling. She spoke of dreams her brother had been having in the weeks before the incident, visions of fire, of a woman in blue who stood still in his path, always silent, always watching. He told her he felt suffocated in his prayers, like something was calling him somewhere he didn't belong. She'd begged him to seek help. He refused. But there was one detail she hadn't shared until now. The morning before it happened, she said during a quiet interview, he left a note on the counter. It said, "I have to stop her from showing them what's coming." When asked who her was, Alia simply looked down and said, "I think he meant the statue." That line, "what's coming," circulated faster than any headline. Podcasts dissected it. Forums theorized wildly. Some claimed it was proof of a divine warning. Others said it hinted at religious delusion. But either way, it reignited the fire. The parish received over 300 letters in 3 days, some of encouragement, others full of venom. One letter simply read, "If it's real, let it speak." Proof. That's what everyone wanted. But as Father Mendez stood in the courtyard that night, watching the candles flicker in the windless dark, he whispered a quiet truth under his breath, one only the truly faithful could understand. Proof isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's the silence that confirms everything. His name was finally released to the public, Yusuf Rahman, 34 years old, a mechanic, no criminal record, no known ties to extremist groups. Just a quiet man with calloused hands, a thinning beard, and a soft voice when he chose to speak at all. But since the day of the attack, he had spoken nothing, not a single word. The police report described him as non-combative but vacant. He ate when prompted, walked when instructed, but his gaze remained fixed somewhere far beyond the walls of his cell. When the court-appointed psychiatrist visited him, she found him staring at the light bulb on the ceiling, lips moving silently. She leaned in close, hoping to catch a whisper, but what she heard chilled her. He wasn't praying. He was repeating a single phrase under his breath. She opened her eyes. At first, it was dismissed as psychosis. The trauma of guilt, perhaps? But when the psychiatrist reviewed the security footage from the attack, something gave her pause. Just as Yusuf delivered the final blow to the statue, there was a fraction of a second where he stopped mid-strike, his eyes wide, mouth slightly open. The video caught it clearly. His hammer hovered in the air. He looked straight at the statue's face, trembling, before letting the tool fall from his hand. He never completed the final swing. Why had he stopped? What had he seen? The psychiatrist tried again the next day. This time she brought a picture of the statue's face. She placed it gently on the table between them and said, "Tell me what you saw." Yusuf didn't speak, but he wept. His sister, Alia, was the only one he would allow in the room. During her visits, he still wouldn't speak, but he would at least meet her eyes. She told reporters he hadn't been well for months, that he had started obsessing over purity, over visions and voices, that he had been plagued by a dream of a woman veiled in blue, standing in a sea of fire, holding back something monstrous behind her. "I think he thought she was evil," Alia confessed. "But now I think he realized she was protecting us." Back in town, the public response to Yusuf's identity grew uglier by the hour. Protesters appeared outside the county jail, demanding punishment. Some held signs that read, "No mercy for desecration." Others claimed he was proof that Islam was incompatible with Christianity, fanning ancient flames of division. But a smaller group stood in silent counter-protest, holding only one sign: "She forgave. So should we." The sheriff ordered the jail staff to rotate shifts. Tensions were high, threats had been called in. But Yusuf remained silent, untouched by the chaos his actions had ignited. He sat in his cell, hands folded, eyes sometimes closed, sometimes locked on nothing at all. And when asked again why he did it, he finally whispered, more to the air than to anyone else, "I thought she was trying to show me hell, but she was showing me myself." It began with whispers, not public declarations, not sermons or speeches, just quiet admissions between neighbors, friends, and family members. "I had a dream." They were different in detail, but eerily similar in tone. In one dream, the Virgin stood beneath a weeping tree, arms outstretched, with smoke swirling behind her. In another, she walked barefoot across cracked earth, her veil trailing light. Some said she appeared beside their hospital beds. Others found her at the edge of a forest, silent and radiant. But all the dreams ended the same way, with her turning to face the dreamer directly and saying nothing. Not one word. And yet, the silence spoke louder than sound. People woke weeping, gasping, shaken but not afraid. They didn't know what it meant, but they knew it wasn't just coincidence. At first, it was just a few stories easily dismissed as suggestion, hysteria, shared trauma. But when dozens came forward, then hundreds, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The local parish began compiling the accounts, keeping them in a large, leather-bound journal titled simply, "The Silence." It sat open in the back pew of the church, and every day, new pages were filled. A nurse wrote of seeing Mary stand at the foot of her bed during a shift, holding the face of the broken statue in her hands. A janitor described a dream where Mary wept over a field of smoldering statues, as if mourning what humanity had forgotten. One child said she was handed a candle by Mary in her dream, with the words, "Hold it until the world is quiet." Then came the night when Father Mendez himself confessed. Standing before a modest crowd at evening mass, he spoke slowly, visibly shaken. "I dreamed of her last night," he said. "She didn't speak. She only looked at me. And in her eyes, I saw the fire of every war we've ever started. I saw hatred dressed as faith. And then, I saw her kneel right where Yusuf struck her and pray for him." The room fell silent. If Mary had appeared in dreams before, it was usually to comfort, to warn. But these dreams were different. She wasn't there to intervene. She was there to reveal and to ask something of those who saw her. Look inward. Even those outside the faith began having dreams they couldn't explain. One agnostic teacher wrote anonymously, "I don't even believe in her, but she came to me. I know she did. And when I woke up, all I could think about was who I've become." No one could explain why it was happening. Science offered theories: mass hysteria, collective trauma, sleep disruption due to media obsession. But none of those answers settled the stirring in people's chests. They didn't need explanations. They already had a name for it: a visitation. And whether it was real or imagined, divine or psychological, one truth settled over the town like a morning fog. She wasn't done speaking, not by voice, but by presence. Her name was Teresa Delgado, 59 years old, a retired seamstress with brittle knees and a long list of prescriptions tucked into her handbag. She had visited the statue many times before years earlier, before her joints began failing her. But since the destruction, she hadn't returned. She didn't want to see the Virgin Mary broken. But after hearing the stories of the girl's drawing, the glowing face, the dream, something stirred in her. It wasn't hope exactly. It was closer to aching, a need to be near something sacred, even if she didn't understand it. So one quiet morning before sunrise, Teresa made her way to the church courtyard with a cane in one hand and her rosary in the other. The air was thick with dew, and the world still felt half asleep. She was alone, just the broken stone, the hush of dawn, and her silent prayers. She didn't touch the face of the statue. She couldn't bend down that far. Instead, she sat on the bench a few feet away and whispered through her rosary, Hail Mary after Hail Mary, like a lullaby to the silence. That's when it happened. The wind picked up not harsh, but sudden. A single gust passed through the courtyard, rustling the leaves above, lifting Teresa's scarf off her shoulder. She shivered and turned her head and saw something she would later say she couldn't fully describe. Not a light, not a voice, but a presence. She reached for her cane to stand but realized she didn't need it. Slowly, shakily, she rose to her feet. The pain that had defined her for 15 years, gone. Not lessened. Gone. Her knees, once stiff and swollen, felt young again. She stood in stunned silence, clutching the rosary so tightly the beads dug into her fingers. She didn't tell anyone right away. Who would believe her? But when her daughter came to visit that afternoon and saw her standing unaided at the stove, making soup, she dropped her purse in shock. Mom, you're walking. I know, Teresa said softly. She gave it back to me. The story spread like fire. Parishioners rushed to the courtyard to pray where Teresa had Saturday. Some touched the bench. Others laid out candles, notes, photographs of loved ones. A small plaque was placed near the platform reading, Here, pain was lifted. Local media tried to corner Teresa for interviews, but she refused. It's not about me, she told them. It's about her. When asked if she saw the Virgin Mary during the moment of healing, Teresa hesitated. I don't know if I saw her, she said, but I felt her. She wasn't shining or floating. She was just there, like a mother sitting quietly beside me, waiting for me to remember who I was before the pain. After that, people came not for spectacle, but for healing. Not just physical, but emotional, spiritual. The statue may have been shattered, but something had taken root in the brokenness. Something that didn't need completeness to be whole. Because miracles, it seemed, didn't wait for permission. They bloomed in ruins. The mosque sat only 4 blocks from the church, modest, quiet, often unnoticed. Its green dome had weathered storms and sun alike, and its congregation was small but steady. For years, the mosque and church had coexisted without tension. There were shared greetings at community events, brief nods between imams and priests, and a mutual respect grounded in unspoken boundaries. That peace wavered after the statue was destroyed. The identity of the attacker had drawn heat to the mosque like dry grass to a match. Strangers parked outside and stared. Anonymous letters were slid under the doors. Some worshippers stopped attending altogether, afraid that their presence alone might provoke someone. But the mosque never issued a defensive statement. Instead, they opened their doors wider. The imam, Sheikh Karim, addressed the congregation the following Friday, standing at the front of the prayer hall as his voice echoed through the quiet. Many in this city are angry, many are afraid. But here, in this space, we are called not to fan fear, but to seek truth. What happened at that church is not Islam. It is not us. It is not the man we prayed beside. His words were met with nods, quiet sobs, and long, reflective silence. But something else had begun to stir within the mosque. It started with a custodian, Hamza, who came early to lay prayer rugs. He reported hearing soft weeping from the women's section when no one was there. Then a teenage boy told the imam he'd had a dream in which a veiled woman in blue entered the mosque and sat among them. He didn't recognize her at first, but when he described the dream to his Christian neighbor, she showed him a picture of the statue's face. He went pale. That was her, he whispered. More stories emerged. During evening prayer, several worshippers claimed the air grew warm near the back corner of the hall. One man said he saw light move across the floor in a slow wave, like moonlight in water, only there were no windows on that wall. One Friday, a woman collapsed during prayer and later claimed she'd been overcome by a vision of Mary placing a hand on her heart. I felt no pain, she said, only shame, and then peace. Sheikh Karim did not encourage hysteria, but he did not silence it either. Instead, he opened the mosque one night for silent reflection, not just for Muslims, but for anyone. No lectures, no debates, just quiet. The room filled, Muslims, Christians, the curious, and the broken. They removed their shoes, entered reverently, and sat in rows. No one led, no one preached. They simply breathed the same air, together. And in the stillness, something happened. Not a miracle, not a vision, but a collective silence so deep, so steady, it felt sacred. For the first time since the statue fell, the divisions faded. And across that floor, beneath the soft dome of a mosque once strained by suspicion, people from all walks of faith began to understand something powerful. Sometimes the loudest message is the one no one dares to speak. Lila had stopped drawing. Ever since her sketch of the Virgin floating above the broken statue spread through the town like wildfire, people had begun treating her differently. Some asked her to draw more, as though she could conjure visions on command. Others looked at her like she was strange, maybe even dangerous. But Lila didn't care about the attention. She hadn't drawn again because she hadn't needed to. Not until the dream returned. It came without warning, just as before: soft blue light, a cold wind, and the woman with the veil. This time, though, Lila was standing in a vast field surrounded by fire. The sky above her pulsed with clouds, and the earth trembled beneath her bare feet. The Virgin stood at the center of it all, not speaking, but beckoning. Lila took one step toward her, and then everything vanished. She woke up with her hands covered in pencil dust. In the dark of her bedroom, she had drawn pages and pages of swirling shapes, strange symbols, and most notably figures without faces. They stood in crowds, looking up at the same statue fragment, the Virgin's untouched face, glowing softly against a backdrop of shadows. When her mother found the drawings, she gasped, "Lila, where did these come from?" "I didn't draw them," she replied, her voice steady. She did. Word spread fast. Father Mendez was called to the house. He arrived with hesitation, not wanting to place any burden on the child. But when he saw the drawings, 20 in total, he sat down in stunned silence. On the final page, written in Lila's careful, backward slanting handwriting, was a phrase he recognized but hadn't heard in years. "She will not speak aloud until they learn to listen without words." He asked Lila if she knew what the phrase meant. She shook her head. "I just wrote what I heard in the dream. It wasn't like she was talking, it was more like she thought it into me." The town, already straining under the weight of mystery, didn't know how to respond. Some dismissed it as coincidence or subconscious suggestion. Others called it prophecy. A few even accused the church of exploiting the child for publicity. But those who had heard Lila speak knew better. There was no performance in her, no drama, just a calm certainty that made adults uncomfortable. And then came the most startling moment of all. During a small gathering in the church courtyard, Lila wandered to the base of the broken statue and stood still. Her mother tried to call her back, but she raised her hand not in defiance, but as if listening. A breeze moved through the courtyard. Then Lila turned and spoke just 5 words. She forgave him. Fully. Already. No one responded at first. It was too much. Too sudden. Too simple. But deep down, many felt something unlock inside them, like a knot being slowly unraveled. It wasn't about revenge. It never had been. It was about returning to the one thing no miracle could force: mercy. The Vatican rarely responded to local events unless there was overwhelming evidence of supernatural phenomena. But something about the convergence of silence, dreams, healing, and a child's unshaken conviction stirred interest beyond borders. A quiet delegation was formed: 2 priests, 1 psychologist, and a historian sent not to declare miracles, but to observe. They arrived unannounced, not in robes or collars, but in plain clothes, hoping to avoid spectacle. But nothing remained hidden for long in a town already straining under the weight of attention. Cameras flashed as they entered the church, and reporters whispered of the Vatican's secret investigation. Inside, however, their approach was careful, methodical, and surprisingly humble. Their first stop was the statue itself, what remained of it. They examined the fragments, took scans of the face, and made detailed notes about the damage patterns. When they asked about the statue's sculptor, Father Mendez provided an old name: Franco Bellini, an Italian artisan who had worked in silence and died before the statue was even installed. The team requested his remaining sketches, curious to see if any symbols matched those from Lila's recent drawings. They did. One investigator, Father Leon, flipped slowly through the girl's sketches and paused on a page that depicted a seven-pointed star above a broken crown. This, he whispered, was carved into the base of an earlier Bellini piece long thought to be symbolic of Marian's sorrow. That same symbol had not been present on the original statue in the courtyard. And yet, Lila had drawn it perfectly. She had no way of knowing it even existed. Meanwhile, interviews were conducted with witnesses of the destruction, those who had experienced dreams, and people like Teresa Delgado, who still walked without pain. The delegation approached each account not with skepticism, but sacred caution. "We are not here to disprove," the historian said during a community meeting. "We are here to discern." Their findings were quiet, but curious. There was no evidence of tampering with the statue's remains. The fracture pattern did in fact appear to miss the face. The dreams shared recurring symbols, many of which paralleled visions recorded during recognized Marian apparitions across centuries. Light through fire, silence before storm, the woman in blue standing between humanity and some unseen sorrow. But most confounding of all was the child. Lila had no prior history of hallucinations. Her school records showed her as quiet, introverted, creative, but never unstable. The psychologist who met her privately described her as disarmingly calm, as though she's not confused by what's happening, just waiting for the rest of us to catch up. As the delegation prepared their preliminary report, the people in town waited anxiously. Would it be labeled divine? Psychological? Dismissed? Father Mendez addressed his congregation one evening and said gently, "No matter what Rome says, something sacred is happening here. It doesn't need validation. It already arrived." Because the true investigation was never about stone or symbols. It was about whether anyone still believed the sacred could break into the ordinary and be recognized when it did. Yusuf Rahman had not spoken in weeks. He sat in his cell with his back to the wall, eyes distant, hands folded as if in eternal prayer. Some called it catatonia, others said it was guilt. But the guards who watched him shift during night duty began to speak of something else, something subtler. It began with a change in posture. Yusuf, once slumped and stiff, now sat upright, still but alert. He refused television, refused meals unless they were placed in silence, and declined the prison chaplain's invitation to speak. But when the janitor passed by his cell humming a soft hymn, an old Marian melody she barely remembered learning as a girl, Yusuf stood for the first time. He placed one hand over his chest and whispered, "I heard that in the dream." The guards reported it immediately. Word reached the county therapist, then the police, then finally Alia, his sister. When she visited him, her eyes welled up before she even sat down. "You're awake," she said, cautiously hopeful. Yusuf nodded, but he looked changed. Thinner, paler, yes, but softer, somehow. The harsh lines that had once carved his face in anger had melted into something gentler. His hands, once clenched with rage, now rested open on the table. "I was wrong," he said softly. Alia blinked. "About what?" "About her," he whispered. "About what she was showing me." She didn't interrupt. Yusuf continued, his voice unsteady. "I thought she was blocking me. I thought she was the enemy. But she wasn't stopping me from something. She was stopping something from me. I don't know how I didn't see it." He closed his eyes. "I saw myself in her silence. Not how I wanted to be, but how I truly was." From that day on, Yusuf began requesting books, not religious ones, not political ones, but poetry. Rumi, Hafiz, even Christian mystics like Street John of the Cross. He requested paper and pens, and though he wasn't allowed sharp instruments, the guards made an exception. Colored pencils. He began drawing. What he drew startled everyone. Dozens of versions of the same figure. A veiled woman, walking barefoot through smoke, reaching for children who held mirrors instead of faces. Over and over again, the theme was clear reflection. Not judgment, not wrath. His psychologist noted in her report, "Subject displays clarity of thought, extreme remorse, and a growing spiritual self-awareness that may be unprecedented in post-traumatic inmates." When asked if he wanted forgiveness, Yusuf shook his head. "I don't think she came to forgive me. I think she came to show me how to forgive myself." That statement was quoted in newspapers, debated on talk shows, and mocked in certain corners of the internet. But within the community where the statue once stood, something shifted. Because the man they had hated, the man they feared, was no longer that man. He was not innocent, but he was no longer blind. And in his transformation, the town saw something they didn't expect. If even he could change, maybe they all could. It began with a few cars parked on the shoulder of the road. Out-of-towners with out-of-state plates, some from as far as Nevada, others from Canada, pulled up quietly, stepped out, and simply stood before the church gates. They didn't shout. They didn't record. They just looked. Then came the buses. Within a week, hundreds were arriving daily. Tour groups, faith-based organizations, curious skeptics, journalists from overseas, pilgrims with aching knees and tearful eyes. Some came seeking miracles. Others came seeking meaning. And some came simply to feel less alone in a world that had been anything but silent. The church courtyard transformed into something more than sacred ground. It became a crossroads of humanity. The cracked pedestal where the statue once stood was now adorned with flowers from dozens of languages, photos of loved ones lost, baby shoes, veterans' medals, tattered letters with ink smudged from tears. The statue's unbroken face still sat at the center, protected beneath a simple glass case. Around it, people wept, sang, prayed, or sat in silence. The media called it a phenomenon. Skeptics called it hysteria, but those who came knew otherwise. It wasn't spectacle drawing them in. It was the stillness. Father Mendez had stopped giving formal interviews. His days were spent among the visitors, helping the elderly find places to sit, listening to whispered confessions from strangers who hadn't spoken to a priest in decades. The Vatican investigators quietly extended their stay, not because they had found proof of divinity, but because they couldn't deny something was happening here that defied ordinary classification. One afternoon, a woman collapsed near the platform, not from illness, but from what witnesses described as an overwhelming wave. She later told paramedics, "It felt like someone took my grief and breathed on it. Not took it away, just made it gentle." That same day, a young man proposed to his girlfriend beneath the statue's gaze. A veteran placed his Purple Heart at its base. A mother brought her nonverbal child, who suddenly uttered a word no one had ever heard him say before: peace. What unified them all was not shared doctrine. It wasn't Catholicism or Islam or anything else. It was something older than any religion. Longing. Every person who gathered had lost something: faith, family, hope, time. And in that courtyard, surrounded by strangers and the remnants of what had once been whole, they found something unexpected. Stillness does not mean absence. Silence does not mean God is gone. The mayor considered blocking off the area for safety, but local officials knew better. To interfere now would be to try and legislate the divine. Instead, they added benches. And so the crowds kept coming, not to see a miracle in motion, but to sit in the ruins of one, to share space with a broken statue that somehow refused to be anything less than whole. And in the growing hush of so many gathered hearts, something began to take shape again, not in marble, but in them. The first time it happened, no one believed it. A local baker, arriving just before dawn to light a votive candle, swore she saw a flicker of blue light above the statue's face, soft, pulsing, like the glow of a firefly frozen in midair. She told no one at first, afraid she'd imagined it. But when it happened again, this time in front of 8 people, it became impossible to ignore. A low, gentle light. No source, no explanation. Not strong enough to illuminate the courtyard. Not bright enough to photograph. But real. You didn't see it with your eyes. Exactly, you felt it. In the skin, in the breath, in the moment your heart skipped without warning. Within days, reports multiplied. The light never appeared on command, never during daylight, never twice in a row. It came like a breath held and released, sometimes above the face, sometimes near the pedestal. Once, a child claimed it passed through her hand as she reached for a flower. Scientists were called in again. Equipment was installed. Cameras with night vision, EMF readers, light spectrum analyzers. But they captured nothing. The machines recorded only wind, temperature, silence. And yet people kept seeing it. Not only that, they started hearing things too. Soft, melodic tones, never words. Not singing, exactly. More like the hum of a lullaby long forgotten. Some described it as bells underwater. Others said it reminded them of a mother humming beside a cradle. Always low, always fleeting, and always comforting. The Vatican investigators stayed longer than planned. They issued no statements, no declarations. But one of the priests, Father Leon, was seen wiping his eyes after standing near the platform for several minutes. When asked by a reporter what he thought was happening, he simply said, "If this is a hoax, then grief is the magician." But it wasn't grief. It wasn't hysteria. It was presence. And then came the night everything changed. It was well past midnight. Only a few lingered in the courtyard, two nurses from out of state, a seminarian, a man who had driven cross-country just to sit in the quiet. The moon hung high and the clouds were sparse. A warm wind passed through the courtyard, brushing the grass. And then, it happened. The lights on the street flickered. The candles, hundreds of them, flared upward at once. Not violently, not dangerously, just brighter, higher. And for 6 full seconds, every person present reported seeing the same thing. The face of the Virgin, still protected behind the glass, appeared to blink. It wasn't movement, not animation, just the briefest closing and reopening of the eyes, as if acknowledging those who had come. And in that brief collective silence, no one gasped, no one screamed. They knelt. And then, it was over. No one caught it on film. No equipment recorded it, but they knew what they saw. It didn't need proof. It only needed stillness. Because sometimes the most unexplainable thing is how something broken can still feel alive. It had been 40 days since the statue was destroyed. The church had made no plans to rebuild it. No commissions had been ordered, no artists contacted. Father Mendez said they didn't need another statue because what they had now was no longer representation. It was revelation. The unbroken face remained in its glass case, set upon a new pedestal carved from the fragments of the original. Around it, the courtyard had become something akin to a living cathedral, walls made of gathered hearts, the ceiling an open sky, the altar marked by silence rather than spectacle. Visitors still came, but something had shifted. No more reporters, no more debates. Just people, mothers with babies strapped to their backs, elderly veterans, recovering addicts, disillusioned teens, interfaith couples, and those who didn't believe in God at all. They came not for proof, but for peace. And what they found was not noise, not sermon, not miracle. What they found was stillness. That morning, a storm had passed through the town, brief but fierce. Rain slicked the sidewalks, wind rattled the trees. But by mid-afternoon the sun broke through, casting golden light over the soaked stone of the courtyard. Dozens gathered for no reason at all. No event, no vigil, just presence. Lila stood beside the platform, her tattered notebook in her hands, but she wasn't drawing. She was watching the light. Her mother asked if she'd had another dream. She shook her head. "She's not dreaming anymore," Lila said. "She's just watching now, like she's waiting for us to remember." Father Mendez gave no homily that day. Instead, he stepped into the center of the courtyard and removed his collar. Not in protest, in reverence. He bowed his head and knelt. And slowly, one by one, the others followed regardless of faith, language, color, or creed. A single guitar note strummed in the distance. Not a hymn, just sound. A woman began to hum. A child began to cry. But not from sadness, from awe. In that moment, surrounded by cracked stone and silent faces, something profound happened. No one spoke. No one needed to. There were no more demands for answers, no more hunger for miracles. Just the quiet recognition that something sacred had passed through them. Not to impress, not to convert, but to remind. That holiness doesn't live in unbroken things. It lives in the broken that choose not to stay shattered. And there, among the crowds, Yusuf Rahman stood quiet, still, unshackled, watching from the gate. No one told him to leave. No one dared, because in that silence, he belonged too. As dusk fell, a breeze moved through the courtyard, gentle and warm. Candles flickered, leaves shifted, and the face of the Virgin, unmoved and eternal, gazed out not with sorrow, not with joy, but with something deeper, a mother's knowing. And in that gaze, the town finally understood what had happened to them. Not a miracle, not madness, but mercy made visible, and silence made holy.